The phone rang once, twice, a third time, slicing through the stillness of the pre-dawn hour. On the other end of the line, a voice cracked with panic. "He's breaking in, someone's breaking in." Heidi's words spilled out in frantic gasps, each syllable charged with fear that clawed its way through the line. The dispatcher barely had time to respond before a deafening blast cut everything short. Silence. Not the kind of silence that settles after a bad connection. The kind that screams louder than any voice ever could. Moments later, another call came. This time it was Nick Firkus. He sounded breathless, wounded, confused, claiming a violent break-in had torn his world apart. By the time police arrived at the little house in St. Paul, the sky was still dark, and the street was eerily quiet. The only noise was the crunch of boots on gravel as first responders approached a front door that would soon become a crime scene. Inside, Heidi lay motionless near the entryway, a life ended far too soon. Nearby, Nick nursed a gunshot wound to his thigh, a wound shallow enough to leave him standing. He told them it was all the work of an intruder. He told them he fought to save them both. At first, it seemed like another tragic story of random violence. But the walls of that house held secrets, secrets that would take years to fully surface. It's easy to believe we know the people closest to us. Easy to believe that trust, once given, is unshakable. But what if the person you trusted most was the very one setting the stage for your destruction? What if the face you loved, the voice you leaned on, was carefully hiding a devastating truth? Heidi Firkus believed she was safe inside her home that morning. She believed her husband was fighting by her side to protect her. She had no way of knowing the real threat wasn't standing outside the door. It was already inside. This wasn't a random act of violence. This wasn't a stranger shattering the life she built. It was a slow-moving disaster, set into motion long before that gunshot rang out. Because sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from the shadows. It comes from the places we feel safest. So before we continue, if you believe every victim's story deserves to be heard, and every hidden truth deserves to be brought into the light, take a moment right now to like this video and subscribe. Your support helps keep these stories alive. Now let's step back to where it all began, before the lies, before the heartbreak, to the day Heidi first met the man who would change her life forever. Heidi Marie Eriksson was the kind of child who made people believe goodness was something you could see. Born on a crisp December morning in 1984, she was the youngest of 3 children in a home where faith wasn't just something spoken about on Sundays, it was woven into the rhythm of everyday life. Her parents, John and Linda Eriksson, raised their family in St. Paul, Minnesota, with an unwavering commitment to kindness, hard work, and humility. Heidi's world was filled with little joys, family dinners that lingered long after the plates were cleared, summers spent riding bikes with neighborhood kids, church picnics where she'd help set up tables even before being asked. She wasn't loud about her faith, she lived it quietly, helping where she could, always looking out for the ones who seemed a little lost. From an early age, her natural instinct to care for others stood out. Whether it was comforting a crying friend on the playground or staying behind to clean up after youth events, Heidi's heart was visible in everything she did. Art became her quiet escape, a place where she poured her hopes and prayers into bright colors and gentle brushstrokes. Her parents watched with quiet pride as she grew, not just into a bright student, but into a young woman who carried herself with a grace that couldn't be taught. Across town, another family lived by similar values. Nicholas James Firkus grew up in a Christian home where Sunday mornings were reserved for worship, and evenings often ended with prayer around the dinner table. Like Heidi, Nick was known for his good manners, his willingness to lend a hand, and his steady presence at every church service, camp, and mission trip. Adults trusted him. Youth pastors leaned on him to set an example. Among his friends, he was the guy who never stirred trouble. Reliable, agreeable, always ready to lead when asked. He played guitar during youth worship nights, helped organize service projects, and seemed, by all accounts, to be exactly the kind of young man any family would welcome without hesitation. It was at Calvary Church's youth ministry where Heidi and Nick's paths first crossed. What began as a quiet friendship, conversations after Bible study, group outings to local parks, team-building retreats, soon deepened into something more. They shared laughter over church camp mishaps, spent weekends volunteering at food drives, and confided in each other about their hopes for the future. Both dreamed of simple things: a faithful marriage, a welcoming home, a life built on trust and shared purpose. By the time they reached their late teens, it wasn't just their friends who noticed how naturally they fit together. Their families saw it too. To everyone around them, it felt inevitable. 2 kind-hearted souls, raised in faith, moving hand in hand toward a future that seemed certain to be filled with blessings. What no one could see, not then, was that trust, once given so freely, can sometimes be the very thing used against you. On a bright spring afternoon in 2005, Heidi Erickson walked down the aisle with a smile so wide it lit up the small church. Family and friends filled the pews, their faces beaming with pride and happiness. The sanctuary echoed with the sound of heartfelt vows, promises made before God, and the belief that two lives were joining together for something good, something lasting. Nick Furcus stood waiting at the altar, steady and composed. To the outside world, it looked like the perfect match, two faithful hearts pledging themselves to a future built on love, trust, and shared dreams. As they walked hand in hand out of the church as husband and wife, their friends cheered, confident they were witnessing the beginning of a blessed life. Their first home was modest, a small house tucked into a quiet street in St. Paul's Frogtown neighborhood. It wasn't flashy, but it was theirs. The kind of place where porch lights stayed on late for friends dropping by after evening services, and where the sound of laughter often drifted through open windows on warm nights. Heidi threw herself into building a life there. She filled the home with handmade decorations, painted the walls soft colors, and filled the kitchen with the smell of fresh-baked bread and Sunday potlucks. They hosted Bible study groups in their living room, organized food drives with church friends, and lent a helping hand whenever someone in the neighborhood needed it. Heidi often talked about the future, about raising children, about teaching them the same values she and Nick had grown up with. It was a life that seemed to be unfolding just as they had hoped. To their friends and family, Nick and Heidi appeared to be thriving. They attended church every Sunday, volunteered for charity events, and hosted small gatherings that brought neighbors and congregation members together. Heidi's warmth was the kind that made people feel instantly welcome, and Nick's calm demeanor gave the impression of steady leadership. Yet, beneath the surface of that well-tended life, small imbalances had quietly begun to take hold. Nick, always the more reserved of the two, naturally assumed control of their finances. Heidi, trusting by nature, deferred to him without hesitation. She often said she didn't worry about the bills, Nick handled everything. If a statement came in the mail, he was the one who opened it. If there were discussions about loans, savings, or budgets, they were conversations Nick had mostly with himself. At the time, there was no reason for Heidi or anyone else to question it. They were a team after all, or so it seemed. In the warmth of their little home, between potlucks and Sunday services, a quiet imbalance was settling into the foundation of their marriage. Nick's gentle control over their money didn't raise alarms. It was just one of those small things people chalked up to different personalities, different roles within a marriage. Heidi trusted. Nick controlled. And life, at least on the outside, continued to move forward. By 2008, the foundation Nick and Heidi had built together was already beginning to crack. But only one of them knew it. Mortgage payments on their home quietly stopped. There were no urgent conversations about money, no late-night confessions around the dinner table. Nick kept the mounting notices to himself, intercepting letters, managing emails, fielding the growing storm alone, or so he wanted Heidi to believe. Instead of telling her the truth, Nick layered lie upon lie. He told Heidi there had been mistakes at the bank, that their accounts were being audited for fraud, that lawyers were involved and everything would be sorted out soon. Heidi believed him. Of course she did. She had every reason to trust the man she married, the man she had built her life around. With quiet optimism, she continued making plans for the future. Small home improvement projects, thoughts about expanding their family, dreams about the years ahead. To her, the home they lived in wasn't just a house. It was the place where love and faith lived side by side, a place she saw them growing old together. Meanwhile, the reality was far harsher. Behind the walls of that modest St. Paul house, the legal wheels had already begun to turn. In mid-2009, after months of unpaid debts, a default was filed against the property. By late 2009, the foreclosure became official. The house was scheduled for a sheriff's sale, where ownership would revert to the bank. Nick said nothing. Heidi, full of hope and unaware of the danger bearing down on them, was still painting walls, still saving recipes for the future family dinners she dreamed of hosting. In January 2010, the inevitable took another step forward. At the sheriff's sale, the Furcus home was officially sold back to the bank. Minnesota law granted a 6-month redemption period, a final chance for homeowners to pay off their debts in full and reclaim their property. 6 months. 6 months that ticked away with terrifying speed, though Heidi remained unaware of the countdown closing in around her. Through it all, Nick kept up the front. When Heidi asked innocent questions, about bills, about savings, Nick brushed them aside with easy assurances. He told her the bank's mistake was nearly resolved. He said the paperwork was being handled by attorneys. He gave her just enough answers to keep her from pressing harder. While Heidi was making plans to host summer gatherings, Nick was staring down a future he could no longer outrun. Heidi looked forward to sunny afternoons and trips to visit friends. Nick, meanwhile, was watching the calendar with growing dread. The final deadline loomed, April 26, 2010. On that day, the sheriff's deputies would arrive to change the locks, remove their belongings, and formally evict them from the only home they had ever shared. As the weeks dwindled down to days, Nick's internal panic sharpened. Heidi was still smiling, still dreaming, still believing in the life they had built together. Nick was quietly collapsing under the weight of shame, fear, and a terrible decision he was already beginning to make. Two lives moving forward side by side, but only one of them knew they were headed straight for disaster. As April 2010 unfolded, the Furcus home stood like any other on the block, quiet, familiar, unremarkable. To passers-by, there was no sign that the family inside was facing a deadline that would strip them of everything. Inside, Heidi was bustling with plans. She made arrangements with friends to attend Sunday services. She talked about upcoming dinners. She mentioned new ideas for redecorating the spare room, perhaps for a future child. Every conversation, every casual plan pointed to a future she believed was still wide open. There was no hesitation in her voice. No fear. If she had known eviction was days away, her friends later said, there would have been signs. But there weren't. Nick, on the other hand, was different. Some friends noticed he seemed distracted. At Bible study groups, he sat more quietly than usual. At home, he was distant, often retreating into long silences that Heidi chalked up to work stress. No one suspected anything deeper. Why would they? Nick Furcus had always been steady, reliable, the kind of man who fixed things when they broke, not the kind who caused them to fall apart. But inside Nick's mind, a battle was raging. The foreclosure clock was winding down. The shame of public eviction, of admitting to Heidi and everyone else that he had failed so completely, weighed heavily on him. Nick wasn't thinking about starting over. He was thinking about how to end it. In those last few days, Heidi's heart remained full of optimism. She reached out to friends to confirm Sunday morning plans. She laughed over coffee dates and shared recipes she hoped to try soon. Her mind was nowhere near the storm gathering around her. She simply lived, believing the foundation beneath her was still strong. Nick's silence grew heavier. He went through the motions, answering questions when needed, nodding along during casual conversations, but the words meant little. Heidi's joyful preparations for a Sunday service and afternoon brunch contrasted sharply with the dread curling tighter around him. There was no last-minute scramble to fix things. No desperate attempt to find help. Nick had crossed an invisible line, a point where survival, for him, no longer meant facing consequences. It meant finding a way to avoid them altogether. In the quiet hours before dawn on April 25, 2010, as the city slept under a blanket of stillness, Nick made a choice. Not to confess. Not to seek forgiveness. But to make sure no one ever knew just how far he had fallen. While Heidi laid out clothes for church and set her alarm with plans for tomorrow, Nick was preparing for something she never saw coming. Trusting him until her final breath. The clock on Heidi's nightstand read just before 6 in the morning when she was startled awake. Somewhere downstairs, a noise, sharp, deliberate, broke the early morning calm. Within seconds, adrenaline surged through her. Fumbling for her phone, she dialed 911, her hands shaking so badly that her words stumbled over each other. "There's someone breaking in," she gasped into the line. Her voice cracked with fear, raw and immediate. The dispatcher tried to steady her. Asked for her address, her situation, but Heidi barely got the words out. In the background, a sudden loud sound, the unmistakable crack of a gunshot, shattered the call. The line went dead. It was less than 30 seconds. Not even enough time for a full plea for help. The dispatcher, rattled but trained, immediately logged the emergency and sent police units racing toward the Furcus home. Before they could arrive, another call came in. This time it was Nick Furcus. His voice was strained, clipped. He said there had been an intruder. He said there had been a struggle. He said both he and Heidi had been shot. The dispatcher pressed him for details, but Nick's answers came slowly, as if every word was a calculation. By the time the first squad cars pulled onto the street, the early light of morning was just beginning to stretch across the rooftops. Officers approached the house carefully, their footsteps crunching over the quiet gravel, their radios crackling softly in the silence. Inside, what they found would haunt them long after. The front door was ajar when officers reached it, hanging slightly open as if someone had fled, or left it that way on purpose. Inside, the house was still. No shouting. No sound of a struggle. Only the sharp smell of gunpowder hanging in the air. Near the entryway, Heidi lay face down, her body motionless, a shotgun wound to her back. There was no pulse. No sign of life. Nick stood nearby, blood staining the side of his jeans where a superficial wound marked his thigh. He clutched his leg, wincing, but he was able to talk, able to move without assistance. When questioned, he repeated what he had told the dispatcher. An intruder broke in. There was a fight. The shotgun went off, hitting Heidi first and then grazing him. The officers scanned the scene carefully. There were no broken windows. No kicked-in doors. No overturned furniture. No signs of forced entry. Nothing looked like the aftermath of a violent struggle. The shotgun was found inside the house, sitting closer to Nick's side of the room. Later, forensic tests would reveal something that couldn't be easily explained. Only Nick's DNA was on the weapon. Still, in those early moments, without direct evidence to refute his claims, the officers could only secure the scene, document what they saw, and start piecing together what little they had. But one thing was clear even then. Something about the story Nick told, the way he spoke, the things he didn't say, left a gnawing doubt no one could quite ignore. In the days after Heidi's death, grief settled heavily over the community that had once celebrated the Furcases' union. Church friends brought casseroles and prayers. Family members clung to one another, struggling to understand how such a tragedy could have struck people so grounded in faith. Nick stood at the center of it all, the grieving husband, wounded but surviving, offering broken words of thanks to those who showed up at the memorial service. To those around him, he looked hollowed out by loss. His head bowed in prayer, his hands clasped tightly together at the funeral, Nick gave every appearance of a man shattered by tragedy. And for a while it worked. No charges were filed. No arrest was made. The investigation stalled, hampered by a lack of concrete evidence to counter Nick's version of events. In time, life began to move forward. Or at least, it appeared to. In 2012, 2 years after Heidi's death, Nick remarried. His new wife, Rachel, came from a familiar circle of church connections. Another believer, another young woman drawn to the stability Nick seemed to offer. Together they built a new life. They moved into a different house, started a family, and welcomed 3 children in quick succession. To outsiders, it looked like a story of healing. A man picking up the pieces of his shattered past and rebuilding. Smiles and family photographs. Sunday services with children in tow. Holiday gatherings filled with the noise of a busy household. But not everything fit as neatly as it appeared. Rachel began to notice things. Small things at first. Missed bills, confusing explanations about finances, unanswered questions that lingered a little too long. Nick controlled all the money. He managed every account, signed every check, reviewed every statement before Rachel could ask about it. The financial strain grew heavier over time, just as it once had with Heidi. And with it came moments Rachel couldn't explain. Odd comments Nick made about that night years earlier, statements that didn't match the version of events he'd once shared publicly. Doubts, once easy to brush aside, began to harden into something she could no longer ignore. The questions about Heidi's death, which had quietly faded from public conversation, were starting to resurface, this time inside Nick's own home. Rachel lived with her questions longer than she wanted to admit. At first, they came like passing shadows, moments she could wave away, excuses she could accept. But the feeling kept growing. Too many inconsistencies. Too many half-answers that didn't quite line up with the man she thought she knew. It wasn't just the financial secrets that troubled her. It was the way Nick spoke about the past. The way he avoided certain details, shifted timelines, or seemed to rehearse parts of the story when asked. Rachel didn't want to believe the doubts gnawing at her, but she couldn't silence them either. At some point she realized she had to act, not because she wanted to trap him but because she needed the truth. For herself. For her children. Quietly, carefully, she began recording their conversations. The recordings were never confrontational. Rachel didn't shout or accuse. She simply asked questions. Questions that gave Nick room to talk, to explain, to reveal pieces of the truth he had buried for years. Bit by bit, patterns emerged. Nick's explanations about Heidi's death shifted depending on how the questions were phrased. Timelines that once seemed firm became uncertain under closer scrutiny. Excuses that had once sounded believable now rang hollow. Alongside the recordings, Rachel quietly collected financial records. Bank statements. Overdue notices. Documentation that showed a life fraying at the edges long before Heidi's final day. When she felt she had enough, Rachel reached out, first to trusted advisors and eventually to law enforcement. Her courage in that moment would change everything. Because while investigators had always suspected there was more to Heidi's death, they had never had the critical inside view that Rachel's evidence now provided. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was a path forward. A path toward truth. A path toward justice. When Sergeant Nicole Sipes reopened the Furcus file in 2019, the case had been dormant for nearly a decade. The official records were thick, filled with reports from that morning in April 2010, statements from Nick, observations from officers, forensic notes. But what stood out most wasn't what was there. It was what wasn't. There was no proof of forced entry. No evidence of a stranger fleeing the scene. No witnesses who had seen or heard anything suspicious in the quiet neighborhood. The original investigation had raised questions, but without clear contradictions, those doubts faded over time. Now, with Rachel's recordings and financial documents in hand, the missing pieces started fitting together in ways they hadn't before. Sipes wasn't working alone. She partnered with specialists from the FBI, experts in forensic audio analysis, behavioral profiling, and crime scene reconstruction. Together, they dug deeper into the 911 calls, examining timing, background sounds, and the emotions behind the voices captured that morning. The findings were stark. The timeline Nick had given didn't match the physical evidence at the scene. The version of events he described didn't align with the way the shotgun had been handled. And Rachel's information provided the critical motive investigators had long suspected but could never prove. Nick wasn't a survivor. He was a storyteller, one who had been trying for years to stay ahead of the truth. With a clearer picture in front of them, investigators moved quickly. They built a timeline that exposed the truth Nick had tried to bury. The financial collapse. The lies he told Heidi. The looming lockout date that would have revealed everything. Piece by piece, they constructed a narrative not of a desperate struggle with an intruder, but of a man backed into a corner by his own choices. In May 2021, more than 11 years after Heidi's death, authorities made their move. Nick Furcus was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. For the first time, the weight of his hidden life came crashing into public view. Friends and former church members, stunned by the news, struggled to reconcile the Nick they thought they knew with the one now sitting behind bars. But for those who had lived with unanswered questions for so long, especially Heidi's family, the arrest was not a shock. It was a long-delayed confirmation of what their hearts had quietly feared. The truth had been buried under layers of lies. But now it had finally been pulled into the light. And there was no turning back. Nick Furcus stood before a jury in 2023, more than a decade after the morning that ended Heidi's life. He no longer looked like the young man seen in old church photos. The weight of years and secrets showed in his face. But inside the courtroom, it wasn't time that was on trial. It was the story he had told. Prosecutors laid out the evidence carefully, step by step. They showed the foreclosure notices, the sheriff's sale documents, the calendar counting down to the lockout day Heidi never knew was coming. They replayed Heidi's 911 call, the urgency in her voice, the fear that crackled over the line seconds before the gunshot ended everything. They detailed how Nick's injuries were shallow, how his account didn't match the forensic evidence. And they leaned heavily on the recordings Rachel had captured, private conversations that peeled away the falsehoods Nick had built his defense on. Witness after witness confirmed the same chilling reality. Heidi was making future plans right up until the morning she died. She wasn't preparing for eviction. She wasn't packing. She wasn't frightened or desperate. She was trusting a man who had already decided what would happen to her. The jury didn't take long. After years of silence, years of unanswered questions, it took them just a few hours to reach a decision. Nick Furcus was found guilty of first-degree murder. When the verdict was read, he showed little emotion. No outburst. No visible breakdown. Only the same controlled expression he had worn throughout the trial. For Heidi's family, for her parents, John and Linda Erickson, the verdict was a bittersweet moment. It didn't bring Heidi back. It didn't erase the years of grief. But it finally gave them something they had been denied for too long. The truth. Acknowledged. Named. Faced. At sentencing, the judge's words were firm. Nick was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. There would be no second chances, no more years of hidden lies. As he was led away in handcuffs, the weight of his choices, the years spent pretending, the life he had rebuilt on top of a grave, finally closed in around him. Outside the courtroom, Heidi's family spoke softly to reporters. They didn't shout or celebrate. They honored her memory the way she had lived. With quiet strength, with dignity, and with an unshakable belief that truth matters, even when it takes years to be heard. In the months following Nick Furcus's conviction, Life didn't magically return to normal for those Heidi left behind. There are some losses so deep, so personal that the idea of moving on feels hollow. John and Linda Erickson continued living in the same modest home where Heidi had grown up. The same home where her laughter once filled the halls, where framed photographs now served as quiet reminders of a life interrupted. They grieved not just the loss of their daughter, but the betrayal that had stolen her from them. But they refused to let grief be the final chapter. Instead, they began speaking quietly, to church groups, to local organizations, about the warning signs that can sometimes be missed. They talked about the importance of trust, but also the importance of openness. About the need to ask questions even when everything seems fine. About how control, even when it appears gentle, can be a warning if left unchecked. For them, honoring Heidi's memory meant more than mourning her. It meant helping others see what she never had the chance to. Rachel, too, moved forward, but not by pretending the past hadn't happened. She remarried and built a new life for her children, carrying with her the hard-earned understanding that trust should never be blind. She speaks openly now about the strength it takes to question what doesn't feel right, even when every part of you wants to believe otherwise. Her courage and Heidi's story have helped others find the words to name their own fears. Because the lesson at the heart of all of this isn't just about one crime or one man's deception. It's about remembering that real love leaves no room for secrecy. Real love invites honesty. Real love never asks for silence when there are questions that deserve answers. Heidi lived her life with faith, kindness, and trust. And even though her life was stolen, her values endure, in the people she touched, in the lives her story continues to protect. Before you leave today, ask yourself, who do you trust? And are you safe enough to ask the questions that matter? If Heidi's story moved you, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories that don't just shock. They teach, they warn, and they honor the voices that should never have been silenced.